which I and a group of us senior comics artists, we initiated that. And since then, a group has done a lot of other very interesting work. The Bhagat Singh book is, I think, a kind of a milestone in your work and growth as an artist, and also, of course, in the comics landscape that we have today of the kind of work that's coming out. Bhagat Singh is a very seminal figure. And I would say both very exciting to address as a graphic novel, also challenging. And I'm a little bit interested to understand your process of, for example, Bhagat Singh is a figure who has been appropriated, or attempts have been made to appropriate Bhagat Singh from the right wing to the left wing. Just about everybody wants a piece of Bhagat Singh. And goes without saying that there are many different interpretations and versions of his story, his philosophy, ideas. Although he himself in his short life put down a lot of his ideas in very clear terms, we still have the sight of people like the Narendra Modi celebrating Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh would probably be turning in his grave to have a person like that celebrate him. However, it happens. I mean, it's been happening across the board in India. And of course, the left parties and the general left, large left, let's say, whatever, the left forces in India have legitimately and rightfully claimed him as theirs. So my first question is, when you started to work on a graphic novel about Bhagat Singh, how did you sort of decide which kind of a view are you going to take? Is it going to be, are you trying to be like a non-partisan view, or are you, what are your sources of research, and who did you read? And being in Punjab, you would have had an opportunity to meet many people who also, of course, have their own very close connections with Bhagat Singh. So what were your sources of, how did you research the book? How did you research the story?
Yeah, Bhagat Singh has been written about repeatedly, time and time again, from different kinds of perspectives. And when I started researching him, I quickly realized that there's a lot of anecdotal history that's floating about him, which reduces his contribution as an ideologue and turns it more into this this martyrdom, shahidi sense of creating a demigod, which is something we are so good at, quickly turning our heroes into this kind of worship-worthy persona. And I instantly felt like, first of all, writing from a perspective of being a Punjabi woman and not a Punjabi man, my interest in his shahidi was not so much the act of the shahidi or the death, but more the way he lived his life and what it led to. Certainly there wasn't, his idea of death was not something he began with. He didn't think that he's going to be, hanged and that will turn him into a martyr and he'll live on in our memories. There was a lot of philosophical inquiry that he was consistently participating in. And what separated him from the other people who were similar in their approach to studying history was that he actively participated in what he spoke of. So he had a lot of interest in being action-oriented rather than just sitting and reading books on Marx or reading books on, I think the last book that he was reading was the biography of Lenin in jail. So he did not merely sit back and consume. And so this is where I think we kind of lose the idea of Bhagat. We never think of him as an intellectual. We kind of think of him as this active participant in the freedom movement. But he was both an intellectual and an action-oriented human. Punjab kind of quickly turns to Punjabi men, I think, feel a kinship for him because there's a lot of shahidi in Sikhism with all the gurus. So they kind of see him as, in the tradition of that. But again, the gurus had a lot of philosophy, and now we know if you read the Guru Granth Sahib or you read what they've written, but a lot of people don't tend to do that. They quite quickly jump, shortcuts are always easier to live by. So, of course, the right wing is so far away from his real sense of who he was that it's almost hilarious when you see them kind of talk about it. It's talk about Bhagat and, embrace him. It's just, I mean, you can't even begin. Where do you now, chip away at that ego sense of living by violence rather than ideology? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think exactly. So there's the right wing, there's the left, of course, and there's this huge, like you're mentioning, this kind of a folk history of Bhagat Singh. So in your storytelling, did you include any of this folk mythology, not mythology, but this kind of folklore around Bhagat Singh? And did you want to just reject that, or did you feel that it had a place in your storytelling?
I mentioned the folk tradition of Punjab and why it's necessary to know about that to see the development of Bhagat. The folk tradition of Punjab has a lot of lovers dying for love. The Soni Mahewal, Heer Ranjha, people who went out of their way to die for the romance and also the belief. So I kind of mentioned that there is a very strong system of folklore which must have influenced any Punjabi growing up in Punjab. It kind of seeps into your psyche. But anecdotal or folk, anything that surrounded Bhagat, like sources, when I was talking to people, I realized that the best way to go about figuring out this historical person was to read what he had written. And he has written extensively about every single topic. He's written about his own childhood in I Am an Atheist. He mentions the way he grew up. So I figured that I may as well mention what he has written rather than going by biographers or people who kind of remembered certain things that other people had mentioned to them. I was a little skeptical and a little wary of bringing up any kind of, I think I only mentioned one anecdote which I found interesting when there's an argument between, I think, two of the comrades about putting up a picture of a Hollywood actress. And that's the only anecdote I kind of pick up. And because I felt that was relevant, and since I'm a woman, I felt like they were speaking about the question of beauty and what beauty is and what beauty represents. I've kind of slipped it in there, but otherwise I stayed away from anecdotes.
Right. Okay, your slides are up. Would you like to take us through some of the pages and images?
Yeah, this
or
is.
Would you like to introduce the book a little bit before you start?
The book, like I mentioned, has a lot of his, it's a graphic biography, so there's a lot of drawing. And it has, it goes through his story, through his writings more than, and there is certainly my perspective on what I would think Bhagat would have liked. It's a quick introduction to Bhagat, but it's things that we haven't heard about him because we haven't read enough of his writings, and things that we feel that I didn't know a lot of things when I started researching. There's so many things, small things that add up to an understanding of a person which I didn't know of. So this is that introduction to Bhagat. And these are the images. It begins with, this is Pagdi Samhal Jatta. It's the Bhagat Singh's uncle, Ajit Singh, was a revolutionary. He was a communist. And so Bhagat grew up in a politically charged family. And Ajit Singh was sent into exile in 1910. And then he kind of just took off and went off to Europe and created his own communist movement and came back in 1947 when India was independent. So this was the movement that his uncle Sardar Ajit Singh had started. It was called the Pagdi Samhal Jatta movement, where the peasants of, he mobilized the peasants of Punjab to fight against a rule that was being passed by the British. So I begin the book with this image, and I feel it's important because it related to the farmers' movement, which is like practically 90 years later. But there have been successive movements in Punjab, one after the other, farmer movements which have been related to either land or land rights. There's constant dialogue, and we probably in the rest of India don't know the amount of field work and the kind of grassroots work that the unions in Punjab have done. So it seemed like the best way to begin was to begin with Sardar Ajit Singh's Pagdi Samhal Jatta movement. This is him mobilizing the farmers. Can we go to the next one, please? And Arijit had, both of us kind of had a brief exchange before I came here, and he said, you know, I would be interested in seeing how you picked up visual information, and like how did you manage to marry the two things together? Because how do you historically research a time period? And it's something that I found challenging. So essentially I did a lot of Google research on the time, and visual material was very limited. So I created these composite collages of what I thought at that time would kind of give you a glimpse of that era. So this is the first page. It begins with Bhagat Singh's birth, and I created this sense of a field where a sapling is coming into its own. And this is the time when Bhagat was born. Can we go to the next one, please? This is the Jallianwala Bagh incident, and here too, instead of creating a drawing which would have shown you the action of that firing and the people dying, I felt like instead of, I turned it into a metaphor. And Bhagat, the next day of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, went to Jallianwala Bagh and picked up a few handfuls of the blood-soaked soil and brought it back in a jar. And so I figured that I could connect the two and create a sense of what it must have been like. He was 12 years old. It must have been, he ran away from home. He didn't tell anyone. So it must have been both moving and horrific. So a lot of visual metaphors is how I navigated through this book. Next, please. This is another, so Lahore was where he grew up, and it spent most of his adolescence and the formative years. And Lahore is now so far away from us. It's impossible for me to go to Lahore or even have people to talk to or exchange ideas with. It's bizarre that it's only a few kilometers from Amritsar, but I can't access their libraries or their visual references. So these were pictures that I took off the internet of 1920s Lahore, and I created a composite, again, a collage composite, a visual, which I felt is what Lahore must have looked like. Next, please. This is Bradlaugh Hall in Lahore, where Lala Lajpat Rai started this revolutionary college in 1919. It was a college where he intended to break the idea of the Guru Shishya, which is something that India is very familiar with. He wanted to democratize education. He didn't want that idea of teacher versus pupil in the classroom. And it's a significant part of Bhagat's development, because this is where he learned a lot. There was a lot of debate, there was a lot of arguments, there was, he came into his own here. This Bradlaugh Hall exists today, looks like this in Lahore, but the fact that we don't know anything about it, it's dilapidated, it's falling apart. They're not looking after it, which is, I mean, it makes sense, because for them, that sense of history, like us, we kind of, we fragmented ourselves from these times, particularly somehow the communist history is not given as much reverence, I feel. Next, please. This is another composite of Lahore, where which has disappeared, which was a collage that I built. Oh, it's back. Great. So took a bunch of photographs, picked up certain parts of things that I liked, and then drew them together. It's almost like a fantasy of Lahore, which I am imagining, but it gives you a sense of what that place may have been like. Next, please. Here is another way of putting them in the geography of Lahore. So it's this is Azad, Chandrasekhar Azad. He's going late night for a secret meeting. These are just a few scenes which I thought I can present to you to give you an idea of how the geography was built. Next, please. So this is when Bhagat cut his hair and shaved his beard and was running away from the British law enforcement. This is when he was, after he had supposedly murdered Saunders. There's really no proof of it, but he never denied it. This is him going to the railway station with Durga Devi, who was the wife of Charanjit Vora, who's pretending to be his wife, and their son Shashi. And at the back is Rajguru, who is pretending to be their servant. So this is again a collage of Lahore and Bhagat kind of becoming this. The British were very terrified of Bhagat. It's strange, I don't understand why, but they felt like since maybe he was the son of Sardar Ajit Singh and Sardar Ajit Singh was in exile, they probably felt that Bhagat was going to be the next big mobilizer, which he would have had he lived long enough. And he did manage to mobilize the country. Yeah, so this is that moment. Next, please. Again, just creating another sense of dialogues that happened. This is in Delhi, Firoz Shah Kotla, where they had their last meeting. So HSRA, which was the party that Bhagat had become a part of, where he had specifically asked for the socialist to be added. It was HRA, and then he said, no, we need a socialist angle to this. So it then became HSRA. And the last meeting they had was in Firoz Shah Kotla, where they were coming, they were deciding on their. So this came up in the trial later on because a chowkidar witnessed this meeting, and he was one of their, one of the British brought him up as a witness to present evidence against Bhagat. Next, please. Again, another collage where of Lahore and how how Bhagat was navigating the web that the British had. Lahore was crawling with CID agents. It was not something that we are familiar with, but it was the kind of a buzzing city with a lot of politically activated, charged situations. And I would love for people to kind of go back into the history of Lahore and read about that, the kind of people that were engaging in this politics. Next, please. So I begin the book by showing Bhagat. This was from a poster, a Kirti Kisan poster. Kirti was a communist pamphlet that was printed in Punjab in the 1920s. And it was a pro-farmers movement, pro-farmers magazine. And so here Bhagat is shaking hands with a farmer. It was, I took this idea from one of the covers of the magazine. Next, please. This is the cover of the magazine. So I kind of replicated that. Next. This is another poster which when the farmers movement was at its finest, that is when I kind of began to revisit the history of the many other movements that have already happened and make posters for that time. Next. These are now, I'm going to talk about the posters that I made for the farmers movement. Because I was working on Bhagat and the farmers movement was happening, and I'm from Punjab, so I was very charged and moved by what was happening, and I felt like I needed to connect. So this was a moment when this was, I think, early on in the farmers movement, when Navdeep, who was this young man, jumped on top of a water cannon and turned it off. So it was this momentous video clip that was being circulated. And I felt like I had to participate in it, and I had to do something, and I just quickly drew a drawing of him. I mean, it's nothing spectacular, but in that moment, I felt the need to be a part of this. It says Chhal. So it's like the leap that was taken. Next, please. This was another poster I made for the farmers movement. It's a story of my uncle who in the 80s was was a part of a strike, student strike that was happening, and this was in Amritsar, and they were being attacked, or tear gas shells were being thrown at them. So I don't know what struck him, but he figured that if he peed on it, it puts it out. And he did that, and then he was arrested. And this photo was printed of him in the newspapers. And my uncle was so embarrassed that he didn't want to go and pay his bail, because he's like, you have ruined my name. And so my Nana went to get him out. But I thought that the Punjabi ingenuity in this moment was, because again the farmers movement was happening, and I was like, wow, yeah, I remember this story, and I hope they see this, because this is one way you can get rid of a tear gas shell. Next, please. This was another poster, which is a woman talking about Main Bhi Kisan, because a lot of times when we talk about farmers, we never think of women. We kind of assume women are the labor rather than the farmers, but if you're a labor in the farm, if you're farming, it doesn't matter whether you're the labor or you're the landowner, you're a farmer. And women own land, women also work in the field, and they should have equal representation. And I think that this brought that up a lot during the protest. Next, please. This is a poster about the scarecrow. A scarecrow is telling the farmers that, if you back down now, the farmer, your death is imminent. So this was for a Punjabi newsletter that was circulating at that time. Next, please. And this is the last poster that I did for Karti Dharti, which was a women-centric newsletter being circulated during the protest. Yeah, that's the poster. That's a painting of Amrita Shergill, the three women, and something struck me to put them on a tractor. And the second I did that, they didn't look as sad and melancholic. They seemed like they had more agency. They had control over their destiny. Yeah, this is the last of that. Thank you.
Amazing. Big hand.
So we have a little bit of time for any questions or any observations, any reactions to
From the
Bhagat
audience?
Singh.
Questions from the audience? Anyone?
So the graphic novel is not just for, I think when we think of graphic novels, we think comics and we assume that it's for children. But graphic novels are, they can be read by anyone, and they're as engaging for different age groups. And a lot of older people who don't like reading books, I think graphic novels is an excellent way to introduce them to a topic which they won't pick up. So yeah, that's my pitch.
Yeah, and not only that, I think graphic novels in some ways are the most complex form of literature, because as we know, words and images are processed in different parts of our brain. So when we read a comic, we look at the image, we read the words, we correlate one to the other, we move, our mind makes mental leaps between frame 1 and frame 2. So our mind is literally doing many acrobatic things while we read comics. And it is my firm belief that kids who grow up reading comics are, as adults, are smarter adults than the ones who didn't read comics when they were kids. Quite the opposite of what the conventional wisdom was, especially when I was growing up, that reading comics would make us dullards, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're taking a smiley face, you're assuming is a smile because somewhere you have coded that idea of this line as a smile, but it's just a line and it's 2 dots.
Yeah.
So these are codes that you kind of read when you're reading. You can recognize different artist styles because there's an intention and a difference in each personal language. You know, each artist is developing his own personal visual language, and the fact that you can recognize the separate styles means that you are being able to decode that artist's personal language.
Yeah, absolutely.
And certainly that's like more than just reading a book.
Yeah.
May I ask a question, Arjit?
Yes, please.
Who are your, so it's quite, Goa's home, we are privileged in a way, and many of us are true believers in the comics and graphic novels. Goa's privileged to have both Arijit Sen, who is really truly the father of the Indian graphic novel, and also Amrita Patil, who's the first woman graphic novelist of India. Who are your inspirations? Where do they come from? Where do you see yourself? Do you see yourself in any particular tradition within graphic novels or in Indian art? I was absolutely charmed, but I also think it's tremendously moving that you had Amrita Shergill, because there is a line that can be drawn from Amrita Shergill to yourself, really. Who are your influences? Where did that come from for you?
I mean, I used to be obsessed with Asterix as a kid, and somehow I gravitated towards it because I would read Chacha Chaudhary and Tinkle, other Indian novel comics, but I didn't feel represented in them. I didn't see, somehow Asterix had long hair like my dad and had a beard, and Gaul seemed like Punjab, you know, like fighting against this idea of the bigger
Actually, you'll
national
find Gaul is
identity.
Goa. I mean, it's very clear that Gaul is actually Goa. But
Yeah, so
No, they just, the Gauls just dropped the BEN before that.
So yeah, influences wise, that kind of drew me in, and I realized there aren't enough stories being told from Punjab visually. And currently, like when I spoke of Sardar Ajit Singh, he's written a biography, and his biography is phenomenal. He was in Europe during the First World War and the Second World War. He spoke French, Farsi. He's traveled through Iran. He was running away from the Scotland Yard constantly. He became a professor in Italy for a short period of time. He was in Switzerland. He was a communist, thoroughbred communist. But we don't know his story, and it's such a visual feast, because when I was reading it, I was like, my God, I would love to tell this story. And this would work really well as a comic, because it's him talking in first person, and you can create visuals easier when that you have that kind of meat. So I'll probably go in that direction. I'm not very sure of what my style will turn into. I think it will keep evolving. I'm not very certain.
Lovely. Look forward to that happening.
I'm very excited. I mean, gosh, it'll take me so long. There's so much work, but it'll be fun.
it does take an immense amount of time. I've seen graphic novelists up close and comic book artists. Origins more of a Tintin man, I think, than Asterix. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
You have to go one way or the other, I think.
You know, back in the day, in our socialist times, choices were always in twos. You know, if you had a scooter, it was either a Vespa or a Lambretta. If you had a car, it was always an Ambassador or a Fiat. Similarly, with comics, you either chose Tintin or Asterix.
And then there were some people who are Mad magazine guys, right?
Mad, of course. Yeah.
which is a wholly different thing. Thank you so much, Ikrup, for coming to launch your
Thank
book
you
here.
for
It's an
having
honor
me.
to have it at the inaugural Liberty and Light Festival of Goa. The fact that your graphic biography, which is a monumental achievement really, that you have really, you can see the work in it. The fact that you've launched it here in a festival which is inspired by another really interesting, indomitable fighter for freedom and a thinker for freedom means a lot. So thank you so much. A big hand, please, for Ikrup Sandhu
Thank you.
and Arijit Sen. Please keep your seats. I know it's been a long day, but the content is incredibly rich still. And of course, in the evening, we will all unwind with Raz Gonsalves and Chandra Mohan S. and Patricia Mukhim and the great Dule Rocker, who will be making his Goa debut. I'd like to call on stage, please, Leandra D'Souza.